There are about 200 people who joined already.
Amazing, huh? The reach of online.
Seriously.
So Mohan, we're live now.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. This is Mohan Lakhamraju. I'm the founder and CEO of Great Learning. And today we have with us Shripati Acharya, who is a managing partner from Prime Ventures. It's great to have you all with us. Thanks for joining us. I see that a lot of people are still joining. So maybe we can give them a couple of minutes to come online. I hope everybody is safe. I hope you are joining from a safe place. Shripati, how are you this morning?
I'm fine, thanks, Mohan. At home, of course, but a real pleasure to be on this talk, and very much look forward to having an engaging conversation.
Same here, same here. So I will introduce you once we have a few more people joining us. I think most of us in India are used to taking a few minutes. So we'll allow for that.
Absolutely.
And people's internet connections and all of those things. So we'll give them a few minutes. So while we wait for them, I just want to share with you and with you all, SmallTalk, this series that we are doing from Great Learning. We decided that all of us are sitting at home. We are all dealing with the isolation. And I think me and some of my teammates realized that we'll go mad if we don't have interactions. So rather than calling our friends and talking to them privately, we said, let's do it publicly. So that was the genesis of SmallTalk. And so we've been doing it now for 3 weeks. Today is the 3rd episode. So in the last 2 weeks, we spoke about the crisis and how to manage through the crisis. In the last week, we spoke to Anurag, a vice president from Wipro, and he gave us perspective of how the IT industry is handling it and how IT professionals should be thinking about this. The recordings of both of those sessions are there on YouTube and LinkedIn, so feel free to look at them. We'll just give a few more seconds and then we'll get started. Exactly at 11:05. So this is going to be informal. Think of this as just two friends sitting and chatting chatting with you as well. So please feel free to post your questions in the chat, and we will take questions at the end. More than half of this session, I want to keep it for questions. After I'm finished with asking a few small number of questions to Shripati, we'll take your questions. This is mainly for you all. The idea behind this episode of SmallTalk is to get a venture capital and venture capitalist investors' perspective on how this crisis is going to shape up and how should startups and folks working at startups should be thinking about. So that's what the broad theme is. And, so we'll explore various aspects of that. Okay, I think it's 1:35. Let's get started. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining this 3rd episode of SmallTalk. My name is Mohan Lakhamraju, and I'm the founder and CEO of Great Learning, which is a edtech company helping people upskill themselves in a variety of digital competencies. And today we have with us Shripati Acharya, who is a managing partner from Prime Ventures, one of the top early stage VC firms in India. So before I introduce Shripati, I just want to make a couple of observations. I'm sure you're all also sitting at home like me. My kids are attending homeschool online, and they have taken over the bedrooms. So I have been given this room, which you can see pretty much the entire room you can see. And it's like about 9 by 10. And I can think of one other institution where the rooms are 9 by 10, where you basically get locked in. So that's what's been going on. And so I think any excuse for interacting with people is very welcome. A couple of other interesting things that I've noted is that now I've been home for 1 month. This is the longest. I have not taken a flight in the last 15 years. This is the longest that I have not worn trousers in the last 20 years. And yeah, so I guess a lot of us are experiencing that. I read a tweet that Anand Mahindra is taking meetings in lungis. So a lot of interesting things happening. So I think, and I'm sure you all are facing situations like that as well, unprecedented situations. So excuse me if the door opens and my kids pop in, or our cat walks in, or anything like that. It's all fair game. So with that, a very warm welcome to Shripati. Many of you in the startup world will already know Shripati. He is one of the smartest guys that I have ever encountered. He is a serial entrepreneur, co-founded companies in the 90s, and then late 90s, Snapfish, one of the earliest photo sharing websites. I think if you are old enough to know Snapfish, then you've been through multiple crises like this. If you've never heard about Snapfish, then this is the first time you're going through a crisis. I think that is a good classification we can follow. Shripati also worked with Nandan Nilekani on the other UIDAI project, and then of course he's been a investor now for 10 years, investing in early stage startups, and in fact building them together with the founders. So very warm welcome to you, Shripati. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hello.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here, Mohan. And of course, I would say that you are being overly generous in your introduction, but that's okay.
Well, so before I ask you about anything business related, let me ask you this. In your introduction, it says that you are a voracious eater of raw plants and vegetables. I'm wondering, what are you doing? Where are you sourcing raw plants and vegetables during this lockdown?
So you'll be really surprised that, we have a very little garden around our house. And so, the spinach, which has been untended for the last few weeks, is now growing some really large size leaves. That's one source. But the other thing which is happening is that the local produce here is actually making its way. And so a lot more local veggies are available here. So anyway, we are lucky that we're surrounded by villages and farm areas here on the outskirts of Bangalore, and so as a result, we're able to continue to get fresh veggies.
Good. And here I was worried that your wife will start complaining that all your potted plants have gone bare. Excellent. So Shripati has funded, and Prime Ventures have funded many companies that are doing quite well: MyGate, EasyTap, HackerEarth, CredX, Effort Plan, and many more. So let's get into it now. Recessions and economic crises are times where actually, while many startups face difficulties and challenging situations, it's also a time where some of the best companies have been forged. Companies like Flipkart, Airbnb, Uber, all of these guys actually got built in the aftermath of the financial crisis that happened in 2008. So I think you built your company, Snapfish, in the before and during and after the dot-com bust, and it was a dot-com company, right? So I think to set the context, it will be good if you can give your background and also talk us about your Snapfish journey and how the dot-com bust impacted it and what you did.
Sure. So just to give it a little context, I went to IIT here in India for undergrad and went to grad school in the US and got my MBA. And after that, I decided to come back to the Bay Area and in tech. And back in '99, co-founded Snapfish with 3 other co-founders of mine. And it was really the height of the dot-com craziness, you could say. Anything and everything was going on the internet. Internet was this fascinating world-changing network where all the information had just become frictionless. The flow of information had become frictionless. You could literally be on the metro in the Bay Area and somebody would start pitching you something. It was that kind of a time. And so we decided to, so my co-founders, one of whom a close friend was my from undergrad, two of them from my business school. And so it was relationships which I had. And so when we started it, we felt, what is it about the net which is very core to it? And communication, of course, is a core thing, right? You could say the first killer app of the net is email and continues to be. And the idea behind Snapfish was that nobody takes pictures and keeps them facing inward. You always have pictures facing outward on your desk because you want to share those pictures. And so internet seemed like a very logical thing, and app and photos seemed like a very logical application for internet. And that's how the core idea of Snapfish started. But to really come to the context of this conversation, the Snapfish was hit by like two massive downturns, right? One, not long after it had started and launched, we had the dot-com bust, which happened in somewhat like the middle of 2000. And it happened so fast that you could just see this, like the kind of like we see the stock markets and public markets going down. Well, if you're in dot-com, it was even steeper than that, right? I mean, there were companies which had been valued at hundreds of millions of dollars suddenly going under and shutting down within a few months. And it was a really a crazy time at that time. And so we managed through that, and managing through just that was actually required a lot of expense management. And if that weren't enough, 9/11 came along, which is when the planes crashed into the World Trade Center, and essentially we were in US watching this live on television, and I just recall this sense of like, wait a minute, like things are never going to be the same again. And sure enough, right, things weren't. And as it so happened, we actually had a term sheet in flight, no pun intended, across that 9/11 period, that week. We were supposed to close. And I recall having this conversation with my co-founders, and we were discussing what is going to happen. And what we were thinking is that, well, almost certainly this is going to get renegotiated. It's absolutely going to happen. And it is not surprising or unfair or any of those things, because we realized that any investor at this point of time is going to say the risk has suddenly increased manifold. And I mentioned this because it's got a lot of relevance to our current situation here. And when entrepreneurs think about the investor standpoint, right? So, but the term sheet did go through, it was renegotiated, and we ended up closing it. And of course, after that, we had to end up, reducing headcount, reducing expenses dramatically, cutting all marketing, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, there was a slow build-up after that, and the company ended up getting acquired by HP, which was a successful exit for everyone. The key lesson here, really, Mohan, is that survival is a precondition to success, right? It's not guaranteed, but you got to be around in order to get lucky and get successful. Every startup which has had a successful exit, there is a sufficient element of luck. But you get lucky only when you're actually in the playing field and the ball comes to you, and you get a chance to score. So that's probably the one thing which I took away from that entire experience. But at any rate, I think that the parallels to that are many in the current situation, and I'm sure we can talk more about that.
Thank you, Shripati. In fact, I can relate to a lot of what you're saying, because I was going through pretty much the exact same experience at that time. So my first startup, Stratify, was started in '99 as well. We raised money in early 2000, and then .com, and then we had to pivot, and then we had to do a lot of cost cutting, and then we had a down round. And then but we pivoted, we survived, and then we had a successful exit, right? So I think there are, all of us have who survived had the story. So I think the lesson that I'm taking from that is that for you to succeed, you have to survive first.
Absolutely.
Right? So right now, survival is success, right? So our definition of what success is changes. So actually, let's talk about that now, right? So having experienced these crises, we have seen how things turn out. Right. So, for many people in India, particularly young professionals, this is the first crisis that they are ever experiencing. For many of the first-time entrepreneurs, or even some second time entrepreneurs, this is the first crisis that they are, because the last 10, 11 years have been just one prolonged bull run, right? So having actually seen the other side of it a couple of times already, what do you suggest? Like, how should entrepreneurs in India and folks working in startups, how should they be thinking about this crisis? So let's start with that from a high level, and then we can dig deeper.
Yeah. So maybe the thing is that startups come in various shapes and sizes, right? There are the early stage startups. There are startups which have raised a couple of rounds of funding and sort of like mid-size. And there are the really large ones, right? Which might have raised a very large rounds. And you could, under normal circumstances, at least a decade ago, they might actually be public. So I'll sort of tailor this conversation to the mid-sized startups, if you will, and then we can also go back to the smaller sized startups, because many of it is applicable. So from a mid-sized entrepreneur standpoint, I would say first and foremost, you might have a team which is, let's say 300-400 people or somewhere in that zone. I'm just, of course, a lot of mid-sized companies might be very efficient and smaller as well. But regardless, I think the first thing here is you have to focus on your team right now. And typically, CEOs and founders have a mantra within their company about customer first, and that is true. It needs to be customer first. But at a time like this, you have to actually go a little bit deeper and say, what is happening to my team, right? You have to first look at the team, and because it's a question of, are they safe? Are they in a situation where their anxiety levels are contained, and really focus on shoring that up first. That's the foundation on which your company is built, is your team and your people, your employees, and making sure that that particular aspect is taken care of. And what does that mean? That means actually a lot of communication from the leaders with their own team, and over communicating at this point of time. You as a leader might be very comfortable with dealing with uncertainty here. And of course, a lot is riding on the shoulders of the founders at this point. But being able to communicate that effectively to their team and saying, look, this is what we are going through. This is how things look. But first and foremost, like making sure that the employees are safe, because their personal safety, their family, and their near and dear ones is very important. So that's on the team side. The second thing aspect to look at is the strategy of the company itself. Suddenly, in the midst of a very furious game which a startup is playing, there's a timeout. I think this is a great analogy, which in a previous conversation you had used, Mohan, which is a pause button has been hit. And so this is a time when actually you can take a step back and see what is my strategy and where is it that I'm headed, and it's headed in the right direction or not. It can mean several things, because what is truly important to the company at this point of time? What are my key products? Who are my key customers? And the world is changing, and how is my strategy going to change with it? So for example, a lot of conversations now can happen remotely. Your customers who previously would not have entertained a conversation remotely are absolutely going to do it, because they understand where you are. You probably have in your home office.
They've gotten used to it.
And they have gotten used to it, and they themselves are in their home office and they are working. They are used to seeing their kids actually take online classes and so on and so forth. So at this point of time, it's worthwhile to understand which parts of my, for example, sales outreach processes can actually become remote. And some of these are actually going to carry through in the post-COVID scenario as well, which of course inevitably will come. So understanding that both how my sales is going to work, how my people are actually going to work in these remote scenarios, which are the areas which are actually getting more interesting, because it's not like all companies are suffering. There's a smaller subset of companies which are seeing a massive traction right now. Taking an obvious example, say you're in the healthcare supply chain, and you're making personal protective equipment, you're making ventilators, you're making components for those, you're in the pharma side. All of these companies are very obviously running 24/7 at this point of time, and they have needs. So maybe you already have a business there. And finally, coming to your customer side, got to have empathy for the customer, because if you are, suppose you're talking to a customer and you have customers in New York. At this point of time, if you're in New York, your biggest concern is what's happening to the city, what's happening to me, my family, my neighbors, and everything else. And it is going to be a very stressful time for them. So obviously you cannot have business conversations at this point of time. But if your customers are somewhere else, also understand that they are getting everybody's reaching out to them, right? And they're reaching out to them online. So they might be very, very busy. So when they are getting bombarded by these requests, you just have to be aware of what's going on. So so team, from a strategy, figuring out where the puck is going, where the opportunities are going to arise. And when you think about that, think about where you can cut and where you can invest. This is not all about cutting this stage. And some of the decisions you make here might actually very dramatically impact the trajectory of the company later, because it can open up areas which you were not initially thinking of. And finally, looking at the customers and communicating to them that, hey, look, we are there. Your existing customers, we are continuing our business. Of course, we are going to function slightly differently, but you don't need to worry about the support we are going to provide to you. I mean, that's the kind of assurance your customers might be looking for. So these look from mid-sized company, I would say this. If you're a small-sized startup, I think that the existential question comes, right? Can I survive? And should I stay or should I fold? Kind of conversations. And it's inevitable that founders have to think about these things. And so my comment there is that if you had confidence and conviction on your business before COVID, you should absolutely continue with this and find a way to survive, which means that you can now go back into a hunker down mode and ride this out. Because if the business made sense then, and you had a product market fit, it will make sense when things start moving back to normal as well. But if you didn't have that, then I think that you must question and ask these questions, whether, what will be the cost of doing business now at this stage, and whether it makes sense to actually shut and then look at other opportunities.
Excellent. So if I have to take away a couple of points from that, so I think, what I took away is that for let's say a little bit more mature startups, right? This is a great time to pause and reassess the priorities, right? Strategy, people, all of those kinds of things. In some sense, they've gotten a little bit of a timeout and a pause to do that. And if you're a young startup, early stage startup, right, then it's a key time to evaluate one, your own conviction in it, your product market fit, and then try and survive. There's something that you mentioned there that actually caught my attention. Right? You said that it shouldn't be all about cutting. It should also be about investing, right? So as an entrepreneur, as a founder, as, the leadership teams within all these startups, right? There's always this delicate balance, right? And you may not always get it right. And you may, you're trying to make decisions with very little information, and nobody's able to see the future, right? So how should people think about those kinds of decisions, right? As an entrepreneur myself, I definitely feel this pressure every day, right? Where should we be investing? Where should we be cutting? So what's your advice to, founders and leadership teams at startups on that subject?
So it's a terrific question. And from an investor standpoint, I can say that we have, I guess, both the handicap and a benefit, that we are looking at things from 1,000-foot level. We are not at the ground floor where you are, the founders themselves. And so the downside of it is that you don't see the details. The benefit of it is that you can probably not focus on the details and look at some of the broader picture. So I would actually, at this point of time, use a technique which is often used. It's called zero-based budgeting, right? Which is, presume you're starting from a clean slate today. Right? It's a thought experiment. Obviously, you're not. There's a business which is in flight, and there are customers, and there are employees, and there are revenues to be had, and so forth. But if you actually do zero-based budgeting, how and where would you allocate your resources, right? And that sort of is a good exercise, because it unclutters your mind from what you are today, because the inertia is a very powerful force. And even more so for startups, because the culture and the focus and what you have been saying to the team and as a result, what you have been saying to yourself has been reinforced over the years. But here might be an opportunity where it might actually make sense to stop doing something and double down on something else. And how do you find that? So I would strongly urge that every company, every single company right now, should go through an exercise similar to a zero-based budgeting and come up with a post-COVID plan, post-corona plan, right? You must have a new operating plan. It cannot be the previous plan, which is just tweaked. And the new operating plan is not the one you're going to execute, but it actually serves as a reminder that, you know what, this might be where I want to go. And this is where I am. And you might actually be able to start making changes accordingly, which makes sense. So my response in summary there, Mohan, is that you have got to have a zero-based budgeting approach. But much more importantly, you need to have rethought your plan. Absolutely. Because this is not a normal event. And the impact of this event is actually going to be fairly strung out. It's not something which is going to happen and in 3 months we are back to normal. I think even if we are, you cannot plan for that, because that means that you're planning for being lucky, and that's not the way you can run businesses.
I really like this idea of zero-based budgeting. I think that's a very interesting concept. Thanks for sharing that. Which brings me to my next question. If you can, let's say, crystal gaze based on, what happened previously in the other two crises that we went through, right? Like, how does coming out of this look like, right? Every crisis is different, right? So, obviously, I'm not going to hold you to this. Nobody's going to hold you to this. But like, what are some of the characteristics? So, for example, a couple of weeks back when we spoke, we spoke about the fact that everybody is going to gravitate towards absolutely essential products and services, right? So non-essentials, will get de-emphasized, right? Things that are considered discretionary will get de-emphasized, right? Similarly, people will gravitate towards low cost, right? Wherever things are more variabilized and low cost, people will gravitate towards that, right? So those things we talked about. So help us understand, what does coming out of this, what can it look like?
So one thing which I can say with a lot of confidence is that nobody knows how long this process is going to last, right? You hear a lot of things, Goldman Sachs might have a report, McKinsey might have a report, etc. Obviously, very smart people thinking through things. But this whole thing is so complicated. There are so many interrelated parts. There are so many unknowns. It's a little bit like, forecasting the weather 6 months from now, that, okay, you know what, on October 10th, it's actually going to rain at this time. Maybe in Singapore, you can say that because it rains every day. But, it's really like that. And so it is unknowable. So it's no point trying to create spreadsheet models for something which is unknowable. That's my belief. But what is things that we do know? We do know that mankind will get over this. And maybe it might take 12 months, it might take 18 months, but it might take 24 months. But after 2 years, this will be in the rear view mirror. This particular crisis. And when you're building a company, you're actually building it for 10 years, 8 years. Like this is, you're already, like, your journey already is significant with Great Lakes, right? And you have a long way to go ahead. So I think that this is what we do know, that in 18 to 24 months, with a high degree of confidence, this thing will be, we'll be getting close to normal. I'm not saying the markets will be where they are, like public markets have their own thing. They might be up a lot before then or so forth. Or some other crisis might be at that time, but this particular crisis will be behind us. So, which means that if that is the horizon which I have, how am I going to execute to it? Okay, so that is something I do know, and we don't need to read the newspapers for that. We'll have a vaccine, we'll have medication, we'll have things which we can do to protect ourselves from this issue. So then the question comes, so if I'm a profitable business, you're in a great shape. Because if you're a profitable business, the destiny is in your hands. And that's one thing which I always encourage our entrepreneurs to think about. You really want to have your destiny in your hands, not in external funders and investors' hands. And the only way you can do that is actually have a break-even business at a minimum. Because then you're sure that you're going to be around when the music starts playing again. So what does that mean if you're not actually a break-even? Because most of the startups are actually investing for growth. And so it's very obvious that they wouldn't be break-even. So I think I would say, at a minimum, if your post-corona plan does not have a runway for 12 months, then I would say that yet it's not well planned. And the reason I say this is that, again, you cannot count on investors to be very active, whatever stage. You might be in seed, series A, B, C, whichever stage you are in. You don't have visibility to fresh funds. Maybe your existing investors have given you that confidence, in which case it's okay. But if you don't, then you have to believe that it will take me quite a bit longer to actually raise funds. And that is the right way to plan. And it's one of those things, right? When you actually try to make money in the long term, you end up making money in the short term. That's sort of my maximum on public markets, right? Because then you are patient and lo and behold, a positive surprise comes up. So very tactically, have a plan which at least has a 12 to 15 month runway, which means that when things start becoming better, which will hopefully by Q4 of this year, we'll have enough advances on the healthcare side and so on and so forth to have a handle on these things. When then you can imagine that the investors will actually be much more willing to look at things for new investment opportunity and so forth. And at that time, a viable business with product market fit will actually be very useful. So I would say that that would be my my take in terms of planning the business processes, and everything sort of flows from there.
So I want to ask you one more question, which is more relevant to individuals, not necessarily companies. And then we'll open it up for audience questions. I already see that there are a lot of questions that are there. And folks, all of you, who want to ask a question to Shripati, please type in your question into the chat box, and we will curate those questions and ask them. And I want to spend as much time as possible on your questions. So the last question from my side, Shripati, is, if you were 25 years old today, but had all the benefit of your experience and wisdom and knowledge that you have, right? And, so if you're a young person at the beginning stages of your career, but knew everything that you did, what would you do? What would you be thinking? What would you do over the next few years? I'm sure, we are a young country, there are millions, tens of millions of people in that exact shoes right now, where the future is not very certain, but but they still have to think and plan for it. So what would your advice be, to your 25-year-old self, knowing everything that you do right now?
So it's a fair question, and I'll try to summarize what I think is is my learnings here. So first and foremost is that understanding that not all moments are created equal, and some moments are more unusual and hence more important than others. And this is one of them. Typically, I would say that the unusual moments, you don't even realize that they're unusual. For example, I recall that when the internet was starting and the first browsers had come out, and you might have known, right, working with Mosaic and Netscape and all those kinds of things, it was exciting, but you didn't quite know how exciting it was going to be. This moment, I think everybody realizes, is like a very different moment than they have had and which they might ever have, right? So I think it is a very important time right now to actually sit back and think through what your career trajectory as a 25-year-old might look like. So making and thinking through and making decisions now is a very important juncture. I think it's a time of transition and deserves a lot of attention. So I would recommend three things here. One is that if you're in your mid-20s, right, first thing is to maximize your learning quotient. I'm not trying to be prescriptive with respect to, do a startup, don't do a startup, etc. Because you have to just maximize the learning quotient. I mean, there's a quote that, the best teachers affect eternity, which means that the influence of a good teacher lasts a lifetime, right? So where are the best teachers in your life? And so whichever job you're in or you're joining, you have to seek out those people. And those are typically, the leaders in the organization. It might be an immediate manager. It might be the founder of the company. So large or small, you have to seek out the best teachers because you have to maximize your learning in the 20s, right? Because that lays the foundation of whatever else which you're going to do. The second thing which I will say is patience, right? Which is that you should have the patience to create a 10-year plan, to create a long-term plan, and what you believe is going to be true 10 years from now. The thing is, funnily enough, it is actually much more possible to broadly be right about the long term than the short term, right? But nobody really focuses on that. And patience is a huge virtue in this particular case, because everyone's just interested in, okay, how do I quickly ascend the ladder in my career? How do I quickly get my startup to actually make money and exit? How do I quickly do this or that? But actually taking a long-term perspective and saying, where do I want to be 10 years from now? And how do I maximize the path to that? Actually trumps IQ. I can guarantee you that you don't have to worry if you didn't go to an IIT or an IIM or any of those things. If you have the patience to actually think through this, and it means a few things. It means that you might actually end up taking a job which doesn't pay as much, but where the learning quotient is high, you actually get to work with a good boss. It won't look good on Facebook posts, but it's actually going to be something which is going to pay dividends very much down the road. So this is where I think character trumps IQ, right? And you have to develop that character. And third thing I would say is optimize the kind of people you work with. It's sort of like related to the first point, but it's a little bit more than just that. Like the folks you meet, your friends. I kind of jokingly say that, your learning quotient, your IQ, your thinking is going to be impacted by those who are on your speed dial. Because everybody can only have like 10 people on their frequently dialed list. So who are those 10 people, right? Thinking of those people like the apps on your home screen. You don't put all the apps together, right? You only use the ones which are most important. So I would say that I would look at those three things, right? Maximize the learning quotient, be patient, plan for the long term, and be really cognizant about who you're spending your time with. And that will actually set a path towards whichever way. You can join a large company, you can join a small company, you can do a startup. But I would try to maximize those.
No, that's a great point that you make. You and I, and we've all benefited from learning from very, very good teachers, right? So and yes, you'll find them in your companies. I also want to share here that in fact we have been having all of our best teachers actually help people learn for free in this environment. So a few days back, we had Professor Abhinanda Sarkar, who was one of our best teachers, do a session online. It was attended by 2,500 people.
Wow.
Yeah, and he's doing another one soon. So I think I completely agree with you. This is a time to expose yourself to great teachers wherever you can find them. And so we are doing our part. We have this thing called Great Learning Academy that we have given for free to everybody who to learn, where there are more than 30 courses that have been kept there. And then we are doing a lot of live sessions as well across many different areas, right? So if you want to learn about skills and develop skills, this is a great place. Like that, I'm sure you can find other places to pick up anything else that you want as well. So this is a great time to be doing that. So thank you, Shripati, for all of those answers. Now let's open it up for audience questions. I see a lot of questions here. Let's take a very specific question right now. So the question is, how will this impact freelancers and contractors compared to full-time employees?
Yeah. So in one sense, as a freelancer or a contractor, you're already an entrepreneur. And you are used to actually getting business. You're used to negotiating rates, and you're used to earning your salary, so to speak. So in one sense, you have I call uncertainties when you don't know what's going to happen to you. So actually, as a salaried person, you actually might have a lot of uncertainty. But as a freelancer, you know exactly what's happening, right? Which might also mean that you don't have a gig, right? So that's stressful in its own way, but you know what's going on. So at this point of time, I think you made the point about learning, right? Is actually have to see where the skills are, which kind of companies are going to be in need of folks. And remember that in one sense, the digitization process, things going online, things getting accessed remotely, all of these have gotten accelerated by 3 years in this period. Everything has gotten accelerated, and you're seeing that in your demand for online courses. You're seeing that in demand for telemedicine. You're seeing that in remote working and everything else which is happening around there. So as a freelancer, I would say, you need to plot your strategy exactly the same way as a startup would. Just look at the areas which are actually going to catch fire and see what are the where your skills are applicable to them, and positioning yourself like that.
I attended a talk some time back where there was a very interesting observation that was made. So apparently freelancers pursue upskilling 60% more than full-time employees, precisely because of the point you just made. Because they're entrepreneurial, they need to always be, looking for their next thing, and they need to make themselves very attractive in the job market. In fact, my personal view is that there'll be more uptick of freelancers. as companies look to cut fixed costs and variabilize, right? So I think they'll depend, particularly in the high cost geographies in developed world, right? Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I think that's going to be the case, because if you think from the company standpoint, they're dealing with uncertainty.
Yep.
So when you're in uncertain environment, you need to have a very flexible cost structure.
Yep.
Going with freelancers makes the cost structure flexible.
Yep. So here's another question, which is more related to leadership behavior. So the question is that, how should team leaders behave with their teams in this kind of environment? On one hand, you need to be strict and you need to be disciplined and professional to get anything done, right? On the other hand, you need to have that empathy, and so how do you think about that, being strict to get things done versus actually being empathetic and being more forgiving? So how should leaders think, team leads?
Yeah. So I think first thing is to be open and realize that everybody is sort of fumbling a little bit, right? Just as the employees are fumbling about how to, sit, and you mentioned about being 1 month at home without having boarded a plane. And I guess you're probably, bracing yourself for a much longer period without boarding a plane here now.
Yeah.
Is similarly, the employees are struggling with the working from home idea. And they understand that as a team leader, you are also going to be struggling with it. So it's okay to first recognize, first of all, so you're not too harsh on yourself as a team leader. The second thing is that, at least from our conversations, we have found that a lot of folks have found things to get a little bit more structured. That's at least the initial reaction, which is that when folks are online in a meeting, everybody's paying attention, and everybody is sort of visible at the same time, right? People are not zoning out. So it looks like being able to set goals and track them will be very important in an online-only environment. But at least the initial reaction is that it isn't as detrimental as people might have thought it to be. And I can totally understand when there is going to be a lot of vigorous discussion and you have multiple people, and the bigger the team meeting, the harder it's going to be. But I would say that at this point of time, there are a lot of text there and experiences around doing things remotely, and folks who have been doing it with remote teams. So I would start like imbibing some of those practices. But one line summary would be, you just have to get more organized about what you want in the purpose of the meeting, the agenda of the meeting, and the notes in the meeting. Right? Yeah, those aspects, which are always good practices for running meetings, will basically be essential to have an effective meeting now.
So there's been a bunch of questions asking about logistics, right? I know you have investments in the logistics industry, so I'll group all of those into one question. So with regard to cold chain, cold storage, with regard to farm agri-tech businesses, right? So I think we've seen that in this environment where the supply chains have been massively disrupted, right? So there are some business models and certain things that are actually shining more than others. So so what the question is around, how is this going to shape up, right? Is starting in cold supply chain areas, logistics, how is that going to shape up?
So I think one thing about logistics is that there's nothing virtual about it, right? It's a physical thing which is moving from place to place. But it's important to realize that it is a cornerstone of any economy. Logistics is. So ports, shipments, truck movement, freight, even more than passenger movement is actually the cornerstone of any economy. So my guess is that our leaders will be thinking about, every country's leaders will be thinking about opening that in the fastest possible fashion, as in the safest possible fashion, right? So I think that if you are in the logistics side of things, that will be one of the that falls under an essential plumbing of a country's economy. Mm-hmm. So my guess is that those things are going to probably see functioning first and foremost. And actually, from some of the things which I was reading about China, is that even the factories are at say 70% capacity and so forth, right? So things are moving, and as a focus is to actually get, when a factory is moving, means all the logistics supply chain behind that is also moving. So I would think that as the things return to normal or get close to it, the first thing which is going to start proceeding towards what was normal order of business. I don't know if that's a question, but that's my belief.
Do you think this will lead to more kind of cutting out of the middleman? You think, that's something that's going to get accelerated by this? Or do you think we're going to go back to, the way things were run before this?
From a logistics standpoint, Mohan, I see a little bit less of that because I think that ultimately you're moving goods from place A to place B, and you cannot disintermediate those relationships all of a sudden. From a consumer standpoint, I can understand that you might actually go directly and start doing a lot more online things, and that's already evidence of that. That folks who are much more with physical retail are actually going to online retail, but that doesn't actually the B2B logistics side of things. At least it's not obvious to me how that's going to get rewired.
Okay, so one more question that came up is that are there any early learnings from China? I think China is about let's say 2 or 3 months ahead in terms of dealing with this crisis. There has been things that have opened up in parts of China. So are there any early lessons that you've learned from there or heard from there in terms of how companies are dealing with this, and what steps have been taken that have worked? Any insights on that?
Well, one interesting thing, I think it's not specific about company functioning, is that, I was just watching something a couple of days back that they have opened up a little bit, and the first thing people are doing is they're beginning travel. So that you might find it surprising, but folks really don't like to be cooped up for extended periods of time, right? And once you have a certain process which enables and sends a message that it's safe to travel, folks will start traveling first near their homes and then increasingly farther away. So just realize that the human behavior, which is wired in a certain way, is not, one fine day going to permanently, in some of these aspects, change. What we are finding is that, in terms of working from home, and these are all, more of the conversations which I have, or the articles which I have read, is that some of these are inelastic changes. So folks are thinking about, whether remote offices and the real estate around that, which is some of the highest cost items for a CFO, are warranted or not. And maybe like some of these things need to become permanent work from home things, like home office kind of situations. So I think we are beginning to see a little bit of that. But I would say too early for us to draw a conclusion other than to say that China was 2 months sort of ahead of everyone in terms of when they're impacted and the lockdown, and then they're getting over. So 2 months from now, we could actually be seeing in a similar situation, presuming equal success in curtailing this pandemic.
So folks, while you're sending your questions, I also want to remind you, this might be a good time for you to subscribe and follow us on YouTube and LinkedIn. There are going to be a lot of sessions like this that are happening, and it is a good way for you to keep track of all that is happening. In fact, in next few weeks, we'll be talking about SaaS businesses, software as a service businesses, and how they are dealing with this. A lot of SaaS businesses got a boost after the 9/11, and in fact, SaaS started after that, and then after the financial crisis as well. And then we'll also be doing a session on global markets and how they're shaping up, and what the impact on Indian companies that are focused on global markets. So those will be coming in future weeks. So let me take a couple more questions. So bootstrapped founders, so they're, what's the advice for them? So there are people that are running small shops, bootstrapped, and so haven't raised money so far. And, so what's your advice for them?
Yeah, I think that you have to focus on actually proving the product market fit. It's easier said than done, but you have to focus on that because any investor will probably be looking for evidence that the product is succeeding in order to do that. The people always, it's always something which investors look for, but in this environment might be even more of a premium on that. So what I would say is that if you're bootstrapped, then the opportunity to raise money might be very limited at this point of time. And instead of actually going and putting the energies on that, might be better off actually going ahead and proving it in a much smaller scale, because you can always, that's one thing which you can dial. If you are going to actually roll this out, your product which you're going to sell to 1,000 customers, you might actually want to do it with 50 and actually get the learnings on those things so you can reduce your costs here. But actually, I would focus on finding real hard evidence of traction and the fact that the business model and the business idea is validated. Because once that happens, fact of the matter is investors will invest. That's their business. And it's a question of whether it is 2 months, 3 months, or 6 months time. But at some point, all these things are going to continue to happen. So it's just that you as an entrepreneur don't know that. So I would actually say that what is it that you can focus right now? Once the cloud's clear, then you're in a good position.
Excellent. Maybe I'll just take a couple more and then we'll wrap up. So one very interesting question. What is your opinion about competitors merging in this environment to actually cut costs and optimize expenses and build scale? That's, do you think that's a good idea?
I think it is always a good idea. But usually the things which actually come in the way of these things are culture, egos, and a whole bunch of other things, right? So this is a time in which maybe some of that with existential issues take the back seat, right? People are much more focused on making something work and much more motivated about it and put these kinds of issues aside. So I think that it does make sense, absolutely, because if you can actually have maybe a smaller piece of the pie, but the pie itself is bigger, then it totally makes sense to do it. Think about it also this way, that in this environment, the number of new competitors arising is probably going to be lesser. The larger companies are actually going to focus on their core things. They might have had ideas about expanding into your area, but given all this, they better actually go and preserve their own revenue. So they are going to cut back. So in one sense, the area becomes less crowded. And in this environment, if you can actually combine forces and create a more viable company, so that has to be the important thing, because mergers are always disruptive, but together you should be more viable than you are individually. So there has to be some synergy, and it needs to make logical sense to do it. But if it does, absolutely, I would think hard about pursuing those things.
Very interesting. So maybe the last question, there's a bunch of questions around, whether, how do you see kind of the new age, technologies like artificial intelligence, data science, are those going to be even more important in the times to come? Do you think there'll be more acceleration towards adopting of those as we get into a recovery, adoption of technology, adoption of automation? How do you see those things playing out? And if that is the case, how should people thinking about, about building those skills?
Yeah, I think it was fairly obvious that AI is core to building tech companies, right? Even before this particular crisis. And as we had briefly talked about earlier in this talk, essentially digitization is going to be on steroids now. Because tracking things remotely, being able to access stuff without physically being there is all going to be critical. For example, like telemedicine, which, in a place like India, you have thought, well, it's interesting, it's important, but yeah, it'll happen over a period of time, has just gotten accelerated by several years, right? The government has clarified the telemedicine policy, removed all the gray areas. The service providers, the healthcare professionals are saying, please go on telemedicine, right? On teleconsult, instead of coming physically to this, right? So there is like a set of forces which we couldn't have actually foreseen. And now the role of AI on that is super important, because now if everybody who used to come to the hospital has gone on teleconsult, now you have all this volume coming in, and you have to be able to, use AI to be an assist in a intelligent way to the doctor here. So how do you do that? So I actually think that several of these initiatives are going to get accelerated, and these things are going to become even more important. And industries which had resisted these kinds of things, like government itself, education, health, all of these are actually going to go headlong into digitization. And as a result, all the supporting technologies which make that happen, AI being one of them.
No, that actually is our view as well. I think, if anything, this thing is going to actually accelerate the move towards adopting of AI and automation and data driven, because the amount of digital data that's getting created right now, because practically everything has moved online.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So the amount of data that's getting created across the board, across industries, and so there's no option but for companies to adopt solutions like that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I think that, and which is basically what we do. That's our mission, helping as many people as possible build the skills in data science, AI, machine learning, cybersecurity, right? All the digital skills that are there. And so we are definitely seeing a lot of people take it up, and we're trying to make it as easy as possible for folks to have very high quality learning experiences. So, so I'm going to end this here. So thanks, Shripati, so much for joining us. Thanks to all the participants for joining this. I think we've had over 500 people who have participated in this session. Folks, do follow us on LinkedIn and Facebook for future sessions, and you'll get posted about those. Like I said, we're going to do something on software as a service businesses, global markets, and so forth. So Shripati, before signing off, any last words of advice that you want to share with our audience?
Not really. I think there is I remember this particular picture in my mind where, so there's this famous photographer called Ansel Adams, which you might have heard of.
Oh, absolutely.
There's this picture of him sitting on top of a van, and it's like clear, sunny thing, and he's like sitting with his camera and waiting, and then they show the picture which he took later, which is this like lightning striking over some very rock hard, cliff faces and so on and so forth. And the title of that photograph was like "Chance Favors the Prepared Mind," right? So he was preparing himself for finding just the right moment to take that picture. I think that's what I would say if you had to take one thing away, that you need to have a prepared mind for this, and then I think luck ultimately will turn its way.
Yep. Luck favors the prepared mind. Wise words for us to end on. It reminded me of another line that I heard: never let a good crisis go to a waste.
Indeed.
So I think we are in the biggest crisis there ever has been. So let's, all of us, let's make sure that we don't let it go for a waste. I know that a lot of us, we're actually like working out regularly, out of desperation and not having anything to do, right? So that's the least we can all do. Many people are actually cooking. People who have never went into the kitchen, they're actually cooking out of necessity right now. So I think in our personal lives, we are definitely taking advantage of the crisis. And so let's do that in the professional lives as well. And like Shripati said, chance and luck prefer the prepared minds. So let's all be prepared. Let's learn, let's upskill. Thank you, Shripati, for sharing your valuable time and joining us. And thanks to all our participants. It's great to have you all. I wish you all the very best, and be safe and take care. Thank you.
Thanks, Mohan. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.